But, well, hey, Christmas is a magical time of year. I'm Pete, if you guys don't know me. I do love this time of year so much. But, if you're a kid, when you're a kid, there's this magic about Christmas that you just can't, stop counting the days till you get there. And when you become a parent, you just try to keep that magic alive. You keep it going. That's why we do crazy things like put an elf on the shelf and things like that. I don't know if any of you have fallen victim to that, but I know that we have. And over the years, we used to do things like putting, toilet paper on the tree and saying that the elf did it and stuff. And we end up destroying our house before Christmas. It was just crazy. But we try to keep those things going. We take our kids to get pictures with Santa, all kinds of different things that we do to try and keep the magic of Christmas alive. And if you're an adult, you don't have kids yet, it just seems like we're always trying to relive those moments of Christmas. It's great. When I was a kid, I loved Christmas time, but I also got sick around Christmas just about every year. It was pretty consistent around the time that I would get sick. In fact, it was so consistent that my parents thought that I was allergic to Christmas trees. And so they stopped buying the live Christmas trees, and we started buying fake Christmas trees. But I still got sick. I got sick anyway. The reality was I knew that I wasn't allergic to Christmas trees. I was actually allergic to something else. See, each and every year, my parents would get me and my two brothers all gussied up, and they would take us out of the house, and every year they would take us to a Christmas cantata. It was somewhere local in our community where a choir would get together and they would sing all these lovely Christmas songs. My parents loved it. I couldn't stand it. I hated it every single year. In fact, when my parents would get me dressed up and ready to go, I could already feel the nausea rising inside me. I was already feeling sick. And as a child, I knew that, the reason I was getting sick every year is not because I was allergic to Christmas trees. I was allergic to Christmas concerts. And so, I could feel it. So my parents would take us sometimes out to eat. I could never eat before we ever got there. And then we would show up at the Christmas concert, and the music would begin. And I just remember looking over at my dad and tugging him on the shirt and being like, I gotta go to the bathroom. And he would he would be so annoyed with me that he usually just be like, no, you're fine. But eventually, halfway through the concert, he would have to walk me out, and I would go out, and I just remember, this is gross, but dry heaving over the toilet, I would just think to myself, this is better than that stinking concert that I just came out of. But one year was particularly over the top because this concert must have been so bad for me that my parents, they drove us 2 hours to get there. I liked the place we went. It was called Pine Brook Bible Conference. Nice place. But the concert itself for me was just terrible. And so I just remember feeling I can make it through it, but I just couldn't. And so I started running for the back of the auditorium towards the end of the concert, and I just ended up throwing up all over the floor. Now, this was a concrete floor, and so it spread out spectacularly like a giant circle. And while I did not intend to trap this kindly older woman that was walking through the audience that day, she must have thought the concert wasn't that great as well because she was making a beeline for the door. And I remember thinking as a child and also the adults who were trying to help me in this moment, we looked up and as if in slow motion, we wanted to say, no, don't walk through there. But she walked right through that and tracked it all the way to the door and certainly to her car, trapping her in the midst of something really disgusting. I didn't mean to do that, but I did trap her there. Now, I didn't set that trap intentionally, but I have set many a trap before in my life, and I'm sure that you can relate. You might have set some traps like this too. Everybody recognizes what this trap is. This is a mouse trap, and many of you have set these in your homes before. And the thing that we're trying to catch in the moment is this cute and cuddly little mouse who's sitting on top of that piece of cheese. It's so funny. My daughter loves mice. In fact, we go to the pet store and we look at them and she says they're the cutest little animal. She says it's her dream to have a pet like this. But it's amazing how when they come into your house, they go quickly from being a cute and cuddly pet that you want to hold to a rodent that you want to exterminate. I mean, something just happens in all of us. So when my wife and I were living in Ohio, we had this house and we had just redone the kitchen and everything. And I remember this time that we had gone out and filled our cabinets with all kinds of groceries. And I remember at the time, money was tight. So it was we were so proud of ourselves that we could fill up our cabinets. And so the next morning when we opened up the cabinet and pulled out the cereal and it kind of leaked out along the way to the, you know what I'm talking about. You've experienced this before. When the mouse chews a hole inside the little box of cereal and then we start looking in there and the mouse had chewed holes in all the other bags of food too. And I remember thinking to ourselves, like we were ready to like pull our hair out. And so with malicious intent, we set like 25 traps inside of those cabinets to capture those mice. That's just what you do. You want to capture the mice. And when we caught them, we felt like we had done ourselves such a good job that we trapped those mice. And if you've ever experienced that feeling, it feels bad and good at the same time, doesn't it? It does. Yeah. So but we set traps also for people. Now, what's interesting about the traps that we set for people, we set them sometimes, and we've also fallen into traps. And I think sometimes, like the traps that we set for people, sometimes they're not intentional. Sometimes they're unintentional, and we're not trying to do them on purpose. But then other times, I do think that we do them on purpose. And the reason why we set traps is we have an attempt to control people. We have an interest in doing that. Now, it can be like a little bit tricky to try and figure out what are some of the things that I do to trap people. In fact, you might be thinking right now, like, what do I do to trap people? So I wanted to put on the screen here some common ways that we trap people. And maybe you can relate with these. Maybe you've experienced these. Maybe you like, oh yeah, I do some of that. But look at this. This is a common way that we trap people. The first one is called a false dilemma. So a false dilemma is this idea that when we present options as extremes. So we say there's a right way and there's a wrong way. Or we say there is my way and there's your way. Or there's a good way and there's a stupid way. Well, with all the options, they're always extremes, and there's only one right way to choose. And so we get trapped in this false dilemma when we think that our options are limited, because the only way, like this is the trap, I have to agree with you in order to make you proud or in order to make you feel good about the situation. And so if I disagree with you, I realize I'm going to make you unhappy with me. And so that's the trap. I have to agree. Like, for instance, an example of this might be, you can fly or you can drive to Florida, but you'd be an idiot if you drive because of the gas prices, right? So, it's like you're presenting two options, but one of them's terrible and the other one's good. In fact, a classic false dilemma was in this movie you might have watched already, is when, the mom said to the kid, you'll shoot your eye out, kid, because you wanted a BB gun. Right? So she's presenting this terrible scenario, this false dilemma, that if he gets a BB gun, he's going to shoot himself in the eye. Now, this movie was made for us parents, so he classically shot himself in the eye, right? So, but the false dilemma was that she set it up, you're going to shoot your eye out if you get that. So if he gets the BB gun and he gets what he wants, he's going to hurt himself. It's a false dilemma, right? Here's another one, second one, using blame and guilt. This is another way that we trap people. We use blame and guilt. We use name-calling and guilt to label others or manipulate them. You might say things like, it's always what you want. Or you might say something like, you ruin our fun. Or you're so selfish. Or you never watch what I like. And so we get trapped in that one when we just don't want to be labeled anymore. I don't want somebody to say that about me. I don't want somebody to call me selfish. And so I fall into compliance. I'm caught now because I don't want you to call me selfish. I don't want you to call me names, and so I do what you want to do. You might hear an example like this. It's your fault because you're lazy and incompetent. And you're caught because I don't want to feel that way again. I don't want you to say that about me. And the third way is this. This is another trap that we use for people. Imposing our purpose on others. We impose our purpose on others. And in this one, we use pressure and expectations to move someone in a desired direction, to move them in the direction that we want them to go. Like, I think you should do this because it's the best way. Or, I can't imagine you doing anything else. Or, any other way would be the wrong choice. So the trap is set when we force our expectations on someone else. And so we get caught when, to avoid letting someone down, we have to meet their desired expectations. An example might be this. A child says to their parent, I want to be an astronaut one day. And a parent says back to the child, I think you'll make a great accountant. right? So like, I want you to be what I want you to be. A classic example of this one was in this movie, High School Musical, if you've ever saw this. It's so classic because the father wants Troy Bolton, the son, to play basketball, and the son, if you remember, wants to be a singer. And so father puts all this pressure to kind of force him in a direction and doesn't let him out of it because he can't imagine his son being a singer when he's so skilled at basketball. So it's interesting, some 3 different ways that we kind of like trap people. And sometimes we do it on purpose. I mean, sometimes we are actually trying to do that to other people. And sometimes, like, it might be out of our good intentions. It might be out of revenge. It might be out of a desire to hurt someone. But traps are always, and I mean always, a method of control. It's a way for us to gain control over somebody else. And maybe you've experienced gaining control over somebody else. You might have also experienced feeling that weight of being caught in one of those traps, which is interesting. So whatever reason or intention that we put someone in a trap or we get caught in it, either way, it strips someone of their free will. So what's interesting this morning, we're going to take a look at a passage where Jesus was actually caught in a trap. And the trap that was set for him was by a group of people that wanted to control the decisions of Jesus. It's interesting because we get an opportunity to see how he responded in the midst of it. And the trap that was set for Jesus was the first one that we talked about. It was a false dilemma. They set up a false dilemma trap for Jesus. And so we have the opportunity to see, what did Jesus do in the midst of this trap? We'll pick it up here in Luke chapter 20. It says, keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. It says they hoped to catch Jesus in something they said, so they might hand him over to the power and the authority of the governor. So in this scenario, these guys were spies. They were sent with the intention of catching Jesus because they wanted to hand him over to the governor. They wanted him out of the way. I don't know why someone would have decided that they hated Jesus so much. Because Jesus was doing good things. I mean, he was like doing miracles. He was healing people. He was being kind. I mean, he was kind of making great waves, providing hope. So it's kind of crazy to think that in the midst of that, someone wanted to kill him or hurt him. But he was also like seeking to provide freedom. And in seeking to provide freedom, it wasn't exactly what the establishment wanted at the time. Both religious and political did not really want someone to experience freedom. In fact, the establishment of the time wanted to control what people were wearing, what people were saying. They wanted to control what people were eating, the way people were behaving. And so the establishment sought to control and modify people's behavior, and Jesus sought to bring freedom, and thus he was really an attack on the establishment. He threatened their control over society. So it says the spies questioned him. And listen to what they questioned him with. They said, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." So they're trying, it sounds like they're giving Jesus a compliment. But this is kind of a setup to a trap. It's kind of like taking the mousetrap and getting it set, right? Like spring-loading it. Because they weren't actually giving him a compliment. They were just preloading what they were about to say. It's kind of like walking into a spider web. You know, the web of a spider is set with invisibility. You know, when they weave their web, it's like this thing that you can't see until we walk into it. And that's just the knack of the spider web. They're able to do that. But they were setting the trap for him. They were saying something nice that he would walk right into the next thing that happened. So listen to the next thing they said. It said, "Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, for you and me, we might look at this and not really know why this is a trap. So let me just give you a little bit of background on this. There were 2 groups of people that were there in the crowd that day. Probably both of them participated in sending spies. So one group was called the Herodians. And the Herodians, they were like non-religious Jewish people that supported the Roman government and supported like the rule of Herod. So they had no religious affiliation. But the way that Jesus taught about freedom was antagonistic to them. So they really didn't like Jesus. So they also did not like what Jesus was doing. And then the other group of people that we talk about often in the church, if you've been in the church much, is called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a Jewish religious sect, and their deal was that they were all about strictly observing the Mosaic law, the Old Testament, the Pentateuch of the Bible, the first 5 books, and the commandments and all those things. And they had written so many other laws, and it was all about strict observance to the law. But in both ways, although they were on opposite sides of the political spectrum, they had a common interest in hating Jesus. So it brought them together. It's something about a common enemy, right? So like they had this common enemy in Jesus, and so even though they didn't really like each other, they came together with one goal in mind, and that was to get rid of Jesus. And so they began to set this trap for him. And this is the trap. It was a false dilemma, or you could even call it a catch-22. Because with this question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? If he were to answer no, then that first group of people, the Herodians, would charge him with treason against Rome, and he'd be handed over to the authorities. So you can't say no. And if he were to say yes to paying Caesar, then the Pharisees would accuse him of disloyalty to the Jewish nation. So if he says no, he's caught by the Herodians. If he says yes, he's caught by the Pharisees. So it was a false dilemma. There was two extremes, but it was also like a catch-22. You actually can't say yes to either answer, which is crazy. And so Jesus was forced in this situation, and they really thought they had plotted this wisely. We were going to push him in one way or another. And if we force him to make the decision of supporting the Herodians or supporting the Pharisees, he loses the influence of the other side and thus diminishes his public following. And so they were hoping in one way or another, they're going to catch him. They're going to trap him, and he's going to be done, which is kind of crazy. So next thing says this. Talking about Jesus, he saw through their duplicity. I just think that's crazy. Jesus standing there in the middle of this, he sees this group of people, he knows what's going on, and he sees through their duplicity. In other words, he knew they were setting a trap for them. And so he says to them, show me a denarius whose image is inscripted on it, whose image and inscription are on it. And Caesar's, they replied. So Jesus says, show me a denarius. So obviously this was the currency of the time, if you're wondering what a denarius was. He said, show me the denarius. And the thing about it was, when he asked them whose inscription is on it, they said Caesar's. The thing about what was going on with that was that the denarius had an image of the emperor on it, and it also said on the image of the emperor, it said that he was divine. So when they looked at the coin together, it would have said that he was either a god or God, some version of divinity. So this was another reason why if Jesus said to pay with that coin to the Jewish people, according to the second commandment where they weren't supposed to have any idolatry, this would have been a breaking of the second commandment, which is interesting. And so with brilliance, Jesus he says this to them in response. He said to them, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. If you've been in church before, you've heard this statement, you've heard us talk about that before, but Jesus, what he's doing here, Jesus is always brilliant, but sometimes when he says things, it's just like, wow, this is crazy. So he's like recognizing the two kingdoms that are at play here. That there is a kingdom of the earth, and Caesar is the emperor of the kingdom that you're living in, right? So there's the earthly kingdom, and then there is the kingdom of heaven, to which God is the ruler over it. And there is a distinction between both of them. But we live in both of those kingdoms, is what Jesus was saying. So we should give the tax that we owe to the emperor of this kingdom, because we live in his kingdom, and we should give to God what is owed to him since we live in his kingdom. This is how Jesus kind of outwitted them. He presented them with a couple more options. And then this is how they responded. So they were unable to trap him in what he had said there in public. And astonished by his answer, they became silent. So they tried to catch him, they tried to trap him, but they were astonished by his answer. I think his answer was astonishing. It was astonishing for them in the moment because they were like frozen. They were like, oh, that's not what we were expecting. We were expecting him to go in one different direction, and he presented these new options and got himself out of the trap. But it also is astonishing for us as we kind of like recognize the implications of what Jesus is saying, because not only did he give us a roadmap for how to escape a trap of a false dilemma, but he also kind of like shows us the direction of how we should, he gives us direction about like the idea of control in general. Because traps are used to control others. And so he kind of speaks to that whole idea. So, just listen for a second. Let's just think about this trap. How did Jesus escape from the trap? Because this is actually like the answer in psychology, which is another reason, like I think, God made the brain, so clearly Jesus being God, he's going to understand the best way to understand people. But So his awareness of the trap was the first step to overcoming it. When he said that he saw their duplicity, he recognized they were doing something here, right? And so, for us, maybe for us to develop some awareness, we might ask ourselves a couple questions. When somebody's trying to trap us, how does this make me feel? And what do I need in this situation? But he had awareness. He had awareness of what was going on. And the second thing he did was to overcome the trap, he gave them new options. He gave them new options. He said, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so Jesus' behavior, his awareness, and his presentation of new options is the way to not allow someone to control us, which is interesting. But his options, like the options that he gave, actually talk about this concept of control in general. And I thought it's kind of like important for us to dig into that a little bit. So like when he said, give back to Caesar, he presented this option, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. For everybody that was listening there in the place, well, at least for the religious side, for the Pharisees, they were thinking, he's a ruler I don't agree with. He's a ruler who's making bad decisions. He's a ruler who has a history of murder and violence. He's a ruler who calls himself divine. In their minds, there was no reason to give anything to him. And Jesus' response to them was like, if you live here, then it's simple. Pay him what you owe him. But I think, like the Apostle Paul, he breaks this down in Romans a little bit further. I think this is an important verse to look at. He said, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. I don't know how you feel when you read that, but that makes me feel a little queasy. Does that make you feel that way? Like make you feel a little uneasy inside? Can we go back once? Let's just read that verse again. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. I mean, this is just like, the authorities that exist have been established by God. This is just an interesting verse to me because I think as we read this, in our context, we look at that and think there is plenty of times when I don't feel comfortable with the authorities that have been established. And Paul just kind of lays this out and says, okay, so Jesus says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. And then Paul breaks it down by saying there's no authority that has been established than it hasn't been established by God. And the idea here is that I submit myself to authority. There's nothing about this that doesn't make me feel uncomfortable. But the definition of submission says to accept or yield to a superior force or to the authority. It's uncomfortable, what Jesus told them to do. But the second thing that he said was to give to God what is God's. To give to God what is God's. So I have to ask myself the question, what is God's? And there's lots of different places that answer this in the Bible, but I just picked one. Is in Psalm chapter 24, verse 1. It says this, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So when I'm asking myself the question, what is God's? Everything. Everything in the earth and me. Everything in the earth. This is what it says in Psalms. And then I have to think about this myself, like as a follower. So this is where there's a little bit of distinction for us in the room. If I call myself a follower of Jesus, then what's my responsibility here in the midst of this? So again, Paul breaks this down in Romans chapter 12. He said, therefore, I urge you brothers and sisters as defining followers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. I highlighted living sacrifice because I think this is so important. Because a sacrifice, everybody knew when he was writing this, that a sacrifice is something that you put on an altar that's completely submitted, right? When it lays down on that altar, it's like, it's not coming back up off of it. And the idea of a living sacrifice is saying, I'm completely submitted. I'm laying down all my rights to God. I'm submitting. And it's holy and pleasing to God. He said, this is your true and proper worship. The idea of when Jesus says, give back to God what's God's, the answer is everything is God's. And my responsibility as a follower is to hold my hands open and say, I'm going to sacrifice what I have for you. Like, God, my life is yours. What do you want with it? And I think that's interesting because when we give God what's God's, I shouldn't hold anything back. So the Herodians who were listening had no desire to submit to God, and the Pharisees did not want to submit to God like that. So when Jesus said, give to God what's God's, they all knew the implication in that scenario, that everything belongs to God, and literally, I belong to God. And that giving back to him what's his is an act of total surrender. And it silenced the crowd. They were astonished by it, that Jesus would respond like this. They were astonished that he would say to submit and to surrender yourself to God. And the idea was that it was countercultural, like nobody else is going to do that, right? Nobody in the crowd was going to do that day. And it was counter-comfortable. It made everybody feel a little bit queasy on the inside. And it was counter-natural. Nobody feels like they should behave that way. But again, Paul said that in Romans chapter 12, verses 1, but the next verse he says this, don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And watch, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That when he calls us to do that, he also reminds us that we shouldn't conform or be okay with the way that the world operates. Because these men were trying to trap Jesus. And he shook the world with his responses when he gave them to them that day. Because he said to submit to the authority that you're under and submit completely to God. I think there's so many things that we can take from this as followers this day. But I think for me as a follower, this statement kind of sums it up. Lay your life down because it's not yours anyway. Lay your life down, it's not yours anyway. As a follower of Jesus, this response is true. That when I think of myself as this is my life and I'll do what I want, not if I'm a follower. If I'm a follower of Jesus, then my responsibility is to lay my life down for him. If I'm a follower of Jesus, then it's not for me to say, I'll do what I want and I'll go where I want and I'll say what I want. The reality is, if I'm following Jesus, I'll lay my life down because it's not mine. I'm respecting the fact that everything is the Lord's on the planet and I am part of that. And this is my responsibility as called by Jesus and God himself. To lay my life down because it's not mine anyway. So oftentimes we try to control people and circumstances, and I think we shouldn't take our cues from the way that the world behaves. This is really what Paul was saying there. We shouldn't take our cues by the way that the world behaves, and we shouldn't make excuses to hide behind our own personalities. We should be transformed by the renewing of our mind. In other words, we don't behave a certain way just because the world says that that's okay. So I have to ask you today, just in kind of following this up, who's trapping you today? Who's trapping you? Because Jesus, his escape from the trap in that moment was awareness. So who's trapping you today? Who's put you in a false dilemma or is using blame and shame to control you? And who's imposing their purpose on you? Who's got you in a place where you're trapped? Because Jesus, his strategy was to provide new options as his way out. But in doing so, when he did that, he did something else. He reminded us that we have the freedom to choose him. We have the freedom to choose him, and he gives us the freedom to lay down our lives as a living sacrifice. It's our choice. He's not going to push us into it. He's not going to make us do it. It's our freedom to choose that. And if God isn't forcing you to do that, then nobody else should have the authority to force you either. But the thing is, when we choose to submit to God, we find out what his pleasing and perfect will is. That's what it says in Romans 12, 1 and 2. And when we choose to submit, we find something special. Find something more than what we expected. It's our choice. No one's going to push us into that, but something amazing can happen when we do. So my other question and follow-up question is, who are you trapping? Who are you trapping intentionally? Have you been consciously using a false dilemma to control somebody? Or have you been using blame and shame to control someone? Have you been imposing your purpose on others? Because the question I have to ask you is, why are you trying to gain control? Why are you trying to gain control of somebody's life? Because when Jesus was trapped, he reminded us that we're his. And that every person on the planet should be free to be able to choose to follow his will for their lives. And if God hasn't forced anybody to follow him, then why should I be trying to force someone to make decisions either? And maybe your next step today is to release control and to decide that it's God who should lead us and move us in his direction and be free to choose his will for our lives. I got to be honest with you, I struggle a lot with this. The idea of control is something that I feel like I want to have in my life. I want to impose my will over other people, and deciding to say, I'm a creation, and I belong to God, and so do you. It's important for me to be able to daily say, I got to surrender. I gotta surrender my will to God's. And so maybe God is calling you today to do that as well, to submit control to him. Because following is not a behavior that comes from someone's control. Following is a response we develop from someone that we trust. We choose to follow God because we trust him. And so when Jesus said that we should give back to God what's God's, the crazy thing is, he didn't just give us a crazy statement like that. He went to a cross and gave everything. And so when he says that we can trust God, the reason why we can trust Jesus, and the reason why we can say, I'm gonna lay my life down and follow you, is because you were willing to do that for me. And the reason I can say that he's got this thing is because I can see his example for me in the midst of it. We can trust him, that if we lay our lives down in sacrifice, he was willing to do it first. Lay your life down. It's not yours anyway. Let's give our control back to the one who is worthy of controlling it. Jesus, I pray that this morning you would help us to recognize the areas of our life where we've tried to take back control for ourselves, and maybe we're trying to use that to trap others, to control them. And maybe I'm controlling myself. Or wherever I might find myself today, God, I pray that you would help me to see it. Help me be aware of the areas of my life where either I'm being controlled or I'm leveraging control to make someone else make decisions. God, in that, I just ask that I would see that when I submit to you, that's when I find what your will is for me. And when I lay my life down, that's when I'm living as what's required of me as a follower. I ask, God, that you'd help us to move in that direction, to trust you a little bit more today than we did yesterday, to step in your direction and to know that you've got this thing, and that, God, we can look to you to lead us and to guide us. Thank you for setting such an incredible example for us. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.